I'm Sean Adams, and I'd like to welcome you to the Foundations of Graphic Design History. I've been studying and teaching graphic design history for 3 decades, and I've helped build and manage the largest collection of graphic design history in the world, the AIGA Historical Archives. One of the first questions you might ask is, why should I care about graphic design history? It's the past. And I would answer that one of the best tools to be a great designer is to have a wide visual vocabulary, and history gives us that. Having a visual library of images stored in your memory gives you a smarter and more varied toolbox. The other point is that design is not Darwinian. That is, it doesn't get better over time. Design simply reflects the culture and the period of time in which it was created. This course is created to provide a solid foundation of the highlights in our graphic design history. I'm not interested in talking about history like your 3rd grade history teacher. I'm more interested in why something looks the way it does and what was happening to influence that. Whether it's a unique way of using contrast or an unexpected approach with typography. The examples we'll explore will always be inspirational. I'm sure you'll finish with more appreciation for some of the great designers in the past, and it will hopefully spark your curiosity to dig deeper. Welcome to the Foundations of Graphic Design History. Just like today, technological change was a driving force in the mid to late 19th century. And like today, people's lives were turned upside down as new inventions changed the way they lived and worked. It's this rise of a society that was more industrial-based than agricultural-based that drove much of the way Victorian design looked. Imagine life before the Industrial Revolution. Most people made their own clothes, or they were custom sewn for them. Almost every item in their house was handmade. Their teapots were never identical to those next door. As new machines and mass manufacturing began to make exact duplicates of items that were suddenly available in huge quantities, this all changed. Now people were able to choose between different teapots, and their shirts were available in different colors. This mass production created competition. So now the manufacturers were thinking, I need people to buy my teapot rather than the teapots from the company down the street. But how can I make that happen? This is the genesis of modern advertising and design. In order to compete, manufacturers turned to posters, placards, and ads to convince consumers to use their products. What could once be a simple note on a wall now needed to be noticed. At the same time, new machines were invented that could handle finer printing. So suddenly, there were greater possibilities for creativity in advertising. Victorian advertising reflects these changes and the values of that period, such as a clear class structure, sexual restraint, and a strict code of conduct. Britain was at the height of its empire, with colonies around the globe. Elaborate ornamentation and mixing of styles from other cultures reinforced the British Empire's colonial strength. These forms were paired with images that reflected idealized nostalgia and moral goodness. This Coca-Cola ad is a great example of a sentimental image representing the goodness of a Victorian woman, and the ornate typography representing the refined and upper-class values of Coca-Cola. The advertising had an air of optimism. New machines and industries were transforming the world and making wonderful products. It was a time of massive technological innovation. Science and industry were going to solve all the problems of poverty, hunger, and disease. We may look at the Victorians and think they're old-fashioned and naive, but the design embraces the new ideas of the time. They were in the midst of rapid change which affected the ways they lived and worked. There are some parallels to today, as it can seem that new digital technologies appear before we've even learned how to use the last ones. Design and technology are always intricately woven together. New printing techniques and tools change the way designers work, and this leads to new styles and solutions. Take the Macintosh, for example. The introduction of this tool in the 1980s not only changed how designers worked, but impacted the look of the things we designed. Now, this gets a little technical, so bear with me. For centuries, books and illuminated manuscripts were hand-drawn, typically by monks or scribes. If you wanted multiple copies, that monk needed to hand-draw each one individually. This took a long time and was very labor-intensive. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. This process began with individual letters molded from metal into slugs. They were combined to create paragraphs. Ink was applied to the metal type, and paper was pressed onto the surface. This process allowed for multiple copies to be made from the same metal type. When the copies were completed, the type was taken apart and recombined into another page or paragraph. By the 19th century, and again due to the Industrial Revolution and increase of products, there was a large need for advertising and promotion. A manufacturer could produce 5,000 cups, but then needed to sell them. The metal type process worked well on books and posters with small type, but the individual letter forms made of metal had a size limitation. When it was attempted to make large headline-size version, the metal forms would break apart. The solution was to make posters only with small type, or find a new way to make big letter forms for printing. Fortunately, an American printer, Darius Wells, began making letter forms out of wood. A printer could carve these letter forms as large as they needed. This answered the call for big type to promote events. This was the birth of the American wood type poster. At first, the printers of these posters tried to emulate the look and feel of the older metal type designs, with elaborate ornaments and a variety of fonts. This was accomplished by mixing large wood type with smaller metal type. It was also very difficult to print images, so printer relied on fanciful typefaces and multiple rules and dingbats to create energy. As you might expect, this mashup of processes created a complex and at times chaotic design. The handmade quality gave a sense of the human touch, which feels warmer and less clinical than some of the typography we use today. It's easy to assume that a new technology replaces the old one. But like radio before television, that's not true. Today, letterpress printing with wood type is incredibly popular. Companies such as Hat Show Print in Nashville are looked at for design excellence. And many schools have built their own letterpress workshops. Wood type and letterpress are usually more economical than offset printing when making smaller quantities. Experimental work, limited edition books, even wedding invitations are perfect for the letterpress process. Over the last 30 years, as design became more and more digitally based, many people yearned for the handmade and organic and returned to the printing technology of the 19th century, creating, again, wood-type posters. Paris in the late 19th century was full of optimism and excitement. Peace and prosperity gave people more leisure time and allowed for the expansion of all the arts. The Industrial Revolution produced thousands of ordinary products that needed advertising. This and the new prosperity created new luxury goods and multiple forms of entertainment to enjoy. And these also required a new form of advertising. We call this period La Belle Époque, or the Golden Age. The limitations of printing technologies created the look of the wood-type poster. By the 1860s, new advances in printing provided the opportunity to use color and imagery with higher quality. Jules Chéret expanded on the typographic wood-type posters and is considered the father of the modern poster. He moved away from type-only solutions and introduced illustrations and a more painterly approach. The images convey a sense of frivolity and fun. He used exaggerated lighting and energetic movement to communicate excitement and pleasure. Many of the posters use a strong X-axis to maintain harmony. The colors are carefully chosen to give the illusion of artificial or stage lighting. For example, a Sarah Bernhardt poster uses blue on her face to simulate a stage-lit shadow. And Chéret integrated the typography into the image with hand-drawn and painted letter forms. Cheret presented women in a new and modern way. Previous depictions in posters and art were of prostitutes or holy figures. His women were called Cherettes and showed the new attitudes. Women in Paris in the 1890s had a less restrictive role. Cheret showed this with lower-cut dresses, smoking, energetic dancing, and even operating new machines like an electric lamp. In the same time period, the flat forms and simplicity of Japanese woodblock prints influenced Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. He took Cheret's approach of an image-based poster, but moved toward a flatter and simpler form. His posters also used theatrical lighting and dynamic movement to create excitement for the entertainment events he promoted. Lautrec's posters integrated the typography as well, but the style was less refined than Cheret's, following a looser approach. Lautrec also used large expanses of negative space and implied form, as Japanese woodblock prints did. He doesn't paint the detail of May Milton's dress. We are only shown a large area of white. The viewer is forced to fill in the blanks to complete the elements in his or her head. Other artists, such as Théophile Alexandre Steinlein, shared Lautrec's passion for Japanese woodblock art and Impressionism. His poster, Le Chat Noir, mixes the solid shapes and high contrast of Lautrec's work with a tighter and less fluid form. The excitement and energy of this period in Paris allowed for the explosion of creativity and innovation. The posters reflect the vitality of the era and the place. The idea of an energetic, image-driven design replaced the informational and static posters from before. Over 100 years later, we assume a poster will be dynamic and exciting. Otherwise, it's just a sign. In the late 1800s, society was bombarded with products and inventions that celebrated the machine-made. In theory, factories were making items that made everyone's life better. Every family on the block could now own a well-made and identical teapot. Class distinctions would disappear and a unified society would emerge. The reality was crowded slums, a massive increase in urban pollution, bad quality products, child labor, and the slow removal of all things handmade. Art Nouveau, or the New Art, was a style that sought to counter this with solutions based on nature and an idealized agricultural medieval life. Art Nouveau forms are typically fluid and flat. Like Toulouse-Lautrec, the Japanese woodblock also influenced Art Nouveau artists and designers. In this case, impacting the use of space, while plant life and the natural world influenced the shapes. Art Nouveau was more than passing fanciful style in graphic design. The ideas of a return to natural forms also influenced architects, product designers, and furniture makers. Candlesticks, chairs, even entrances to the Paris metro adopted the Art Nouveau aesthetic. Aubrey Beardsley was the bad boy of Art Nouveau. He illustrated books and limited edition prints. The subject matter ran toward the grotesque and erotic. The style is black and white with high contrast. The shapes are fluid and clearly are derived from the natural world. He used shapes from flowing vines, peacocks, water, and flowers. The peacock skirt was drawn for an edition of Oscar Wilde's Salome. The images shocked the British public. Wilde was also unsettled and worried that Beardsley's grotesque imagery and strong style would overshadow his words. In addition to Oscar Wilde's Salome, Beardsley created a series of illustrations for Sir Thomas Malory's book, The Death of Arthur. These illustrations became Beardsley's best-known work. The subject matter is an idealized medieval Camelot. Beardsley begins to incorporate harder-edged borders and elements from illuminated manuscripts. Alphonse Mucha's posters and illustrations for advertising share Beardsley's fluid forms and idealized romantic past. Mucha, however, incorporated color and complex pattern. Many of these illustrations were intended for large-scale posters rather than small books. At small scale, these may seem less dramatic than Beardsley's high contrast, but at actual poster size, the effect is hypnotic. Mucha used Arabic and Byzantine decorative motifs for the patterns, borders, and typography. Like Beardsley's connection to Camelot, Mucha uses these foreign forms to comment on the goodness of a more agrarian culture with handmade design. Incredibly, we are in the midst of a similar reaction today, this time with the digital and technological. Again, we see a movement towards organic forms, handmade production, and an idealized reverence for pattern. For a designer who has known nothing but the computer screen, this seems like a radical and new idea. It would be simpler if I stated that one style of design displaced the previous style, and everything in design history was nice and sequential. But movements and styles tend to overlap or branch into other areas and ideas. This is the case with Art Nouveau and the arts and crafts movement. They share similar principles and occurred in the same approximate time, but have different results. William Morris is the acknowledged leader of the arts and crafts movement. Like the artists who worked in the Art Nouveau genre, Morris also rejected the Industrial Revolution's bad quality and lack of skilled workmanship. His book design embraced the idea of the artist and worker coming together to make a unique object of beauty. The books of the arts and crafts movement were often printed on small presses with limited quantities. The emphasis was on quality, not quantity. Every part of the book, from the typeface, pattern, paper, binding, and materials, was refined. This reflected the importance of craft over mass production. Looking back toward an imagined romantic period, the work had intricate hand-drawn patterns based on natural forms, and the subject matters were sentimentalized and idealized, often focusing on the agrarian age with topics such as Chaucer, knights, and medieval poetry. Unlike Art Nouveau, the designers working with an arts and crafts approach filled the negative space with pattern and decoration. This relates more to illuminated manuscripts before the invention of the printing press than to Japanese woodblock art. The arts and crafts movement launched a renaissance of book design. The quality and manufacturing of books was in a dismal state as the publishing industry looked to cheaper ways to manufacture. This renewed appreciation for the book arts spread from Europe to the United States, sparking an interest in small presses and limited editions. Architects such as Green and Frank Lloyd Wright adopted many of its ideas and transformed them into building concepts. Fine handmade woodwork, artist-created stained glass, and a connection to natural elements are all part of an arts and crafts building. One of the most lasting effects of the arts and crafts movement is the commitment of design to quality. The movement prevented a slow slide into fast, cheap, and low quality as an accepted fact. Today, good designers and printers strive to create the highest quality product, obsessing over every detail. By the turn of the 20th century, young artists began looking beyond the complex forms of Victorian design, Art Nouveau, and arts and crafts. The ideas in the air at the start of a brand new century were about new and fresh approaches. For these young artists, the world of medieval poetry and complex patterns had no place in this brave new world. Lucien Bernhardt was 15 years old when he attended an exhibition in Munich of work that moved away from the drab tones and clutter of the Victorian era. He was, as he said, walking drunk with color through the exhibition. He went home and painted every wall and all the furniture in his room with these new bright and vibrant colors. His father kicked him out of the house, but he made the giant leap into realizing that design could be minimal and clear. Bernhardt's poster for Priester Matches is a perfect example. His original solution had dancing girls, a cigar, table, and a tablecloth, but one by one he took each item away, determined to get to the core of the communication, which was simply matches. This solution is the beginning of modern graphic design today, that relies on symbols and shapes rather than literal illustration to promote an idea. This school of work is known as Plakatstil, or poster style. Other German artists, such as Ludwig Hohlwein, working in the poster medium, were also exploring simple shape and minimal decoration. The use of implied form with negative space is an incredible way to make the viewer work. This is a good approach. The more a viewer tries to understand the visual, the better he or she will remember it. The typography was created by hand as part of the illustration and was also reduced to the most basic message. Strong, vivid colors, abstract and flat pattern, and a rejection of anything decorative are the hallmarks of the German poster movement. These artists, without knowing it, also were the first to work with modern corporate identity. The idea of a logo today is a simple icon and name. This can be traced back to that original Priester poster. The effects of the German poster period are with us in modern identity design, minimal posters, and the basic concept of less is more. It was gathering momentum and becoming a major force. But as we'll see next, the movement was derailed in 1914 by World War I. On June 28, 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. This effectively began World War I in Europe. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain all now needed to promote their own message to recruit volunteers, rally the troops, and convince the public that their fight was good and victory was possible. There was no radio, television, internet, or social media, but new cost-efficient printing technologies allowed for mass production of posters, and these became the primary tool for war propaganda. The explorations and stylistic approaches of Art Nouveau and arts and crafts were quickly set aside. The British, French, and American governments commissioned the work and preferred an approach that favored realism and traditional images. Britain, France, and America relied on messages of patriotism, home, family, and a man's role in society. British posters questioned a man's masculinity if he did not enlist, as in the poster, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" Others appealed to a man's sense of honor for the women of Britain. American posters used images such as Uncle Sam and the American flag for patriotism. 4 million copies of James Montgomery Flagg's "I Want You" poster were printed and distributed across America. Unlike the British posters, the American posters are direct and straightforward. Uncle Sam looks directly at the viewer and commands the viewer to join the army. A Marine stands before the flag and demands that the viewer become a Marine. Even President Woodrow Wilson stares directly at the viewer and commands them to stand by him. Before the war, an average American would not go farther than 20 miles from their home for their entire lives. Recruiting posters promised the idea of adventure and excitement overseas. German posters continued to use the simplified Plakatstil approach. Simple symbols and typography communicated messages of strength and victory. Hans Rudi Ertz's poster for the film U-Boot heraus, or The U-Boats Are Out, uses the simplified form of a sans serif U to frame the abstract figure of a U-boat commander. The strong shapes and dramatic action depict the commander as a new type of hero. The poster uses hand-drawn lettering and bold areas of flat color, integrating image and text into one message. Other posters appeal to Germany's medieval past and the honor of the country. While these posters are aesthetically strong, the abstraction and lack of realism had little or no emotional impact. Today, we are bombarded with images and messages. It's difficult to imagine a time when a poster was the most critical propaganda tool for the war effort. The era of World War I was the first time that the power of design was used effectively on a mass scale. These posters did the job of radio, television, and the internet combined. The first time I was given the assignment to research graphic design and the Soviet Revolution, I thought, why should I care? I'm not a communist. But the way we approach graphic design today originated during the 1917 Russian Revolution. Let me set the stage in very simplified terms. Russians are fighting against the Germans during World War I. For centuries, the ruling classes, the Tsar and monarchy, had oppressed the bulk of the population, mostly living in poverty as peasants. As the population moves from an agrarian way of life to the cities, they face horrible conditions and disease. When Russia enters World War I, there were widespread food shortages and there was tremendous inflation. People questioned why they were fighting in a war for leaders who neglected their citizens. This disillusionment triggered the explosion of revolution. In 1918, the people rise up against the Tsar, the Russian army abandons the war against Germany, and the Soviet state is born. At the onset of the revolution, designers with radical new ideas were welcomed into the movement, and over the next 2 decades created most of the work we now know as constructivist. These designers rejected the personal expression of fine art and viewed decorative ornamental design as symbols of the aristocracy's oppression. They created a new style and were determined to speak to the masses. Gustav Klutz's poster 5-Year Plan is geometric and bold, using the symbol of a hand and simple shapes to convey a message rather than a representative illustration. The typography is sans serif, rejecting decorative fonts. Elements are turned on an angle to suggest forward movement and energy. The red background celebrates the Soviet flag. The popular message to the Russian people from the Soviet leadership was that this new society created equality for all people, removed the aristocracy and class structure, and would enable the Soviet Union to move forward with industrialization. The handmade was personal and elevated the individual over the state, so this was rejected in favor of machine-made forms. Elizitsky's poster Beat the Whites with a Red Wedge uses an intrusive red wedge to symbolize the Red Bolsheviks in a battle penetrating their opponents, the White Army, during the Russian Civil War. Photography replaced illustration. As a mechanical process, photography celebrated the machine and the industrial. An illustration represented self-expression, which the constructivists rejected. The constructivists believed that old disciplines such as drawing, painting, and traditional graphic design were obsolete. They integrated methods such as photomontage and overprinting to their posters and publications. Graphic design was not a form of art. There was no room for personal expression. It was a collective discipline on the same level of culture as industrial manufacturing. While this may seem harsh to us, the result was a shift toward the function of something rather than simply the aesthetics. Simple tabs to denote sections in a publication might appear ordinary now, but they were new functional tools for the constructivists. By the late 1920s, the Soviet political structure began to move away from strong abstract forms and photomontage. They now considered the constructivists to be radical intellectuals, and the work to be a representation of capitalist cosmopolitan culture. The Soviet government demanded design be realistic and not abstract. As the tenor changed, many of these designers left Russia for Germany and the United States. We see the influence of the constructivists today in graphic design stylistically. But it is the concepts of functionalism, design for the common man, abstract geometric symbols, and the preference for photography that are their strongest legacy. We like to think we live in a time of radical and unprecedented change, and in many ways we do. However, the early 20th century was a chaotic combination of new inventions, technologies, and the shift from an agrarian lifestyle to an urban culture. Like today, there were some people intent on holding on to the old traditions, and other people that didn't think the changes were fast enough. In 1909 in Italy, Filippo Marinetti formed a group of designers called the Futurists. These people wanted the changes and wanted them to happen quickly. They rejected the traditional approach to art and design entirely. They wanted to celebrate the components of the new industrial society: speed, machines, war, and revolution. The work used typography, energetic forms, and chaotic composition to communicate their idea of the new world. Marinetti wasn't interested in working within the confines of society. He wanted radical and violent change. He shocked people by demanding, "We will destroy museums," referring to them as graveyards littering Italy. The Futurists hated harmony and classical forms. They viewed these as remnants of a culture only interested in recreating the past and pacifying the masses. They created work that treated typography as painting, energetic and illegible. Like a speeding automobile or train, typography was to be expressive and dynamic. Energy was the top priority. The Futurists collaged elements from different sources together. Since harmony requires a sense of unity, they discarded that and purposely slammed together found typography, paint, and drawing. The Futurist movement was over by 1918. Most of the Futurists revered war, violence, and the destruction of the old. When World War I began, they quickly enlisted. By the end of the war, very few were alive. In 1915, in Switzerland, a different group of artists and designers were gathering in opposition to World War I. Unlike the Futurists, who revered war and destruction, they were pacifists and responded to the horrors of war by creating the Dada movement. Dada rejected reason and logic. They were interested in nonsense, irrationality, and intuition. There are many ideas as to the source of the name Dada. However, most believe that it is a nonsensical word. These designers and artists worked to shock the bourgeois or middle class population. Art was considered bourgeois, so they made anti-art. The Dada Manifesto promises the abolition of logic, social hierarchies, memory, and the future. Work was random and improvised. The typography and form was often random or used elements of Dada poetry, also nonsensical as its source. By World War II, the Dada movement died out, so many of the designers and artists shifted towards ideas such as surrealism or modernism. Even more were killed in Hitler's concentration camps, categorized as degenerate artists. Both the Futurist and Dada movements changed the way we look at typography. Type was not simply a choice of a legible typeface or a way to decorate a poster. It was a picture of a word. Typography could be expressive and dynamic, or like an illustration, used solely as a compositional element. Today, every time we choose a typeface as a way to communicate a tone or idea, we are referencing the Futurists and Dada movement. The Futurists and Constructivists wanted to destroy the old world and create a new one based on the machine, industry, and socialism. The leaders of de stijl, or the style in Dutch, also rejected the traditions they believed caused World War I. But, unlike the Futurists and Constructivists, they wanted to rebuild the world with an approach that merged math and harmony. In 1917, a group of artists, architects, and designers came together in the Netherlands to create the movement. Its leader, Theo van Doesburg, wrote, "The old is connected with the individual. The new is connected with the universal." An individual with personal expression might use images and forms that were specific to one political regime. However, an individual designer could not own reductive abstract geometry based on mathematical proportions. These are universal forms. They could not be related to the Soviets, the Germans, British, or any nation. As I mentioned before, design is a product of its time and place. In this instance, the rational minimalism is related to Dutch values of Calvinism and discipline. Working with a limited palette of colors and square shapes, the De Stijl designers hoped to create solutions that talked to everyone and lost any sense of national or personal identity. Austerity and purity drove much of the graphic design and typography. Invitations, announcements, and magazines used sans serif fonts and large amounts of white space. Designers working with the De Stijl ethos used only the color palette of black, white, and primary colors. These were pure and universal, as opposed to more complex colors that could be considered personal. At one point, Van Doesburg designed a font to remove even more of any sign of individual personality. The letter forms are made of square shapes, dispensing with any curves or extra elements. This severe approach, however, proved difficult to maintain. It's human nature to create something personal. As the movement matured, seemingly small allowances were made, such as using a 45-degree angle. This new direction caused an enormous rift in the group, and by 1924, the group disbanded. One of the greatest legacies of De Stijl is the idea of working across many forms of design. The approach was intended for graphic design, architecture, products, and fine art. It was a utopian philosophy that, contrary to its name, was not just about style. It was about the human condition, society, and our ability to live together in a peaceful and harmonious culture. And of course, there is the legacy of the Partridge Family bus. Perhaps the most important influence on contemporary design is the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was a school in Germany, training designers in all fields. To this day, most design education is based on the Bauhaus teaching method. The Bauhaus was the place where all the previous movements and styles came together. At the core of all these prior movements, constructivism, futurism, Art Nouveau, De Stijl, and arts and crafts, was the idea that design could make the world a better place. This was the guiding principle at the Bauhaus. Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus in 1919. Like the leaders of the other movements at the time, he believed the old order of aristocracy and corruption had led Germany into the catastrophic war. Design would create a new society and a better way of life. He saw the solution as a return to an earlier medieval time when artists and craftsmen worked as one. But he wasn't interested in medieval romantic forms. Like the constructivists, he viewed the machine and an industrial civilization as the way forward. These tenets of the Bauhaus created a style that would dominate the rest of the 20th century. They are the central ideas of modernism. First, a designer should strive for the highest quality and craftsmanship. Herbert Bayer's poster for a subject as ordinary as a collaborative housing project adopts perfect geometric forms and highly refined typography. Second, less is more. Ornament was corrupt and unnecessary. A brochure for the town of Dessau's tourist office doesn't show the details of the heavily ornamented town hall, the Rathaus Dessau. It focuses on a modern airplane and the simple Bauhaus building. Third, work should be true to its materials. Wood should look like wood, and steel should look like steel. The metal on this chair is metal. The straps are leather. Internal forms of the chair are all exposed. Nothing is hidden under heavy fabrics or pretends to be anything other than metal and straps. Next, form follows function. The design of something should be functional, never decorative. The invitation to the inauguration of the Dessau campus is divided into specific areas for image and information. Times are highlighted in red, and the typography has a clear hierarchy. And good design, manufactured with mass production, ensured equality and harmony. Marianne Brandt's tea and coffee set is based on pure geometry and uniform materials. There are no meaningless flowers or any ornamental details. The simple forms could be mass-produced and bring harmonious beauty into an average home. The Bauhaus building at Dessau is a good example of these ideas. It is not a grandiose structure filled with statues and marble. It is a machine for education, a factory to teach. Graphic design at the Bauhaus was minimal and lacked any unnecessary decoration or elements. The Bauhaus was the central point where the old world ended and the new world began. It was a culmination of World War I, industrialization, and all the previous movements. The way we live, work, and design today is either a direct result of the Bauhaus or a reaction against it. The fact that much of the work still feels fresh and clear is a testament to the solid principles of Bauhaus modernism. Graphic design at the Bauhaus focused on typography, shape, and color. Professors integrated the tenets of modernism into the classes and workshops. In product design, furniture making, and architecture, design for the masses slowly replaced Gropius's original idea of designer as craftsman. In graphic design, however, the refinement of form and typography maintained the concept of craftsmanship. Typography was one of the Bauhaus's greatest legacies. It was bold and clear with simple sans serif fonts. At one point, this was simplified further by Herbert Bayer's attempt to create a typeface with no capital letters. The typography was based on rational and mathematical systems. Grids and the golden section were part of each solution. Every element, from a word to a hairline rule, existed to serve a function, from indicating where a letter begins on a letterhead to organizing text into legible blocks. Design solutions favored photography, again due to its realism as opposed to something handmade or interpretive like a painting. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy introduced experimental photography with unusual points of view, montage, and darkroom techniques. This enhanced the design work, adding dynamic energy. The photography moved away from a static image taken at eye level and shifted to a cinematic approach. The camera could be placed at a bird's eye view or from the ground up. The subject was part of a larger world beyond the frame of the image. The next time you watch any action movie, you'll see these ideas used over and over. Color at the Bauhaus followed the ideas of the De Stijl movement. Black, white, and primary colors were universal and not attached to any specific political party or nationality. Professors Johannes Itten and Paul Klee taught foundation classes in color and shape. The exercises they invented are used by most design courses today. In 1932, the Nazi Party had taken over the German government. They quickly shut the school down. The Nazis, in charge of the faculty contracts, deemed the work to be Bolshevik and degenerate. The students dispersed, and many of the teachers migrated to the United States, sparking a revolution in design. 80 years after the last student left the building, we see examples of the Bauhaus influence, specifically good design for the masses. Companies like Design Within Reach, Crate and Barrel, and Target use this as a core value and marketing message. The Bauhaus also left designers and the masses with a new philosophy about design. Today, the public expects a product to be functional. It should be the best quality and aesthetically beautiful. They demand graphic design be clear and legible, and mistrust work that is too elaborate, ornamental, or hard to understand. But most importantly, it is not even questioned that a designer works to make life better. Jan Tschichold was one of the many typographers influenced by the Bauhaus. In 1923, when he was 21, he visited an exhibition of work from the Bauhaus. The exhibition profoundly changed his way of thinking about typography. Tschichold was trained as a traditional calligrapher at the Leipzig Academy. Before visiting the Bauhaus exhibition, his work was symmetrical and based on classical typefaces. For 5 years after visiting the exhibition, he refined his new approach to typography and published Die Neue Typography. Die Neue Typography promoted asymmetry, sans serif fonts, and repulsion to the degenerate typefaces and arrangements of traditional typography. Following the tenets of the Bauhaus, Chisholm believed typography should never be decorative. Its most important job was to relay information as efficiently as possible. There was no room for expressive and personal work. For Chisholm, typography should be asymmetrical, dynamic, and energetic. This mirrored the modern world and the new ways of working, celebrating the machine rather than the human hand. Proportions were tied to the golden section, and mathematical calculations determined the placement of elements on a layout. In the hands of a lesser typographer, this approach could lead to utilitarian and banal solutions. Chisholm added another layer onto the functional aspect. He recognized the value of beauty and incorporated the values of harmony and spiritual content. The new typography is characterized by the use of sans serif fonts, preferably one font in a range of weights and sizes. Symmetrical layouts were not efficient, as they forced the content into one form, regardless of the message. Asymmetrical layouts provided a solution that created better hierarchy. Content drove the solution for efficient communication. Like the other designers at the Bauhaus following the rules of modernism, Chisholm favored photography, as it was truly representational and precise. Illustration was subjective. His color palette was limited, working mostly with black, white, red, and yellow. Again, this removed the designer's role as an artist choosing a wide range of colors. It promoted the idea of a universal visual language. Color existed to aid the viewer in the communication and provided hierarchy only. Negative space became an important element. Chisholm also added rules, bars, circles, and boxes to aid in efficient reading. These also expressed a kinetic energy connecting to the new age of the machine. In 1933, the Nazis barged into Chisholm's Munich apartment and arrested him and his wife. He was accused of creating Bolshevik and un-German work. After 6 weeks, he was released and took his wife and 4-year-old son to Switzerland. Ironically, after the war, Chisholm moved to London and rejected the new typography. He now believed that designers should work with humanist forms and integrate classical typography. In 1946, he wrote that the new typography's impatient attitude conforms to the German bent for the absolute and its military will to regulate. The objective of the new typography was clarity, not decoration. This philosophy became the guiding rule to most of the typography we see today. As information becomes more complex and dense, take, for example, the barrage of information on screen during the television news, clarity becomes more important. So in many ways, the new typography is more relevant today than it was in 1923. In the 1920s, designers and artists at the Bauhaus were working to reduce form to only its functional elements. At the beginning of the 1930s in Paris, the idea of purity and geometric forms found a voice. However, a softer, more elegant approach emerged. It is during this time that we see the rise of the poster as a great art form. Economically, France was not devastated by World War I like Germany. The effects of the Great Depression were present, but the situation was not as dire and harsh as post-war Germany. Luxury goods, travel, and entertainment continued to have a strong market, which of course leads to advertising. Printing technologies had also improved since the age of Charret and Toulouse-Lautrec. Now a designer could work with finer tonal values, gradations, finer typography, and a larger variety of colors. Shadow, dimensionality, and fine lines could now be printed successfully. One of the leading designers in poster art was A.M. Cassandra, a Ukrainian immigrant living in Paris. He didn't have one set approach based on de style, constructivism, or any movement. Instead, he liberally borrowed elements from each of these. Each of these movements promised a utopian society. Cassandra's only connection to this philosophy was implied wealth. Cassandra's posters promoted luxury cruises, travel, expensive products, and an upper-class lifestyle. Other designers used gaudy and Baroque forms to illustrate these subjects, as if wealth were about gold and ornament. Cassandra used the minimal geometry and iconic imagery of the Bauhaus and constructivism. His poster for the Normandy is genius. It is abstract, not realistic. It is a series of subtle tones and gradations in a few simple shapes. The scale is exaggerated. The elements work together harmoniously with no unnecessary forms. Cassandra's forms may appear soft and fluid, but have an underlying grid based on geometry and repeating forms. The posters are image-based, telling the story without the use of verbiage. The typography, also echoing the other forms, in this case a circle, served as a secondary element. Other designers in Paris adopted some of the same concepts. These posters succeed with the rigid structure of proportions and shapes, combined with scale and a sense of grandeur. Big is huge, small is tiny. Negative space defines objects, and the same shape is repeated many times on each composition. These designers lived in a world with moving buses and automobiles. They designed these posters for maximum impact when seen briefly from a moving car, bus, or train. The colors and tones have high contrast, and the details of the image are deleted. The typography, typically, is only the name of the product, letting the image do all the work. This culture of exquisite poster design is part of our concept of a romantic Paris of the 1930s. They are the basis for advertising today. Create a sense of excitement and adventure and invite the consumer to be part of this refined world. This approach of a hard-hitting, fast read is at the heart of every street poster, billboard, or magazine ad you see today. It's nice to think that design is driven by aesthetics and good values. In many ways, it is. But in the United States, it is intimately connected to commerce. Design is the oil in the machine of capitalism. The 1920s were a boom time in the United States. Advertising increased dramatically as the need to sell products grew. Magazines, at their most basic, are features surrounded by ads. They existed then, as they do today, not to tell a story, but to sell advertising. This boom in advertising created a period of innovation and new ideas in magazine design. In the 1930s, even as the country fell into the Depression, magazines were the dominant form of communication. Radio existed, but the magazine advertising was the best way to promote visually. Art directors gained power and more control over the photography and layout choices. Ideas from the European avant-garde and the Bauhaus began filtering into the design with a wave of immigration from Germany. Joseph Binder's 1937 cover for Fortune magazine utilizes the geometry of the Bauhaus, drama of French poster design, and dynamic forms of constructivism. Other American art directors began incorporating dramatic negative space, geometric forms, graphic photography, and experimental typography. Seppi Pinelli's was one of the first women in the field to rise to prominence. She took ideas from constructivism and softened them to create a distinctive look for magazines like Vogue and 17. Photography at the Bauhaus, with its unexpected photographic cropping and point of view, as seen here on the cover of Harper's Bazaar, influenced many of her choices. Alexei Brodovich immigrated to the United States to escape the Nazis in the 1930s. He became the art director at Harper's Bazaar. Brodovich was a fan of A.M. Cassandra and encouraged him to spend 2 summers in New York in 1936 and 1937. The result was a series of striking covers. Other covers and interior spreads borrowed from avant-garde typography at the Bauhaus, using clear typefaces and strong shapes. Brodovich was a genius with composition and scale. He played with montage and mixing typography and photography. These were all ideas taken directly from the European avant-garde, yet tailored to an American audience. Unfortunately, magazines were printed in giant quantities, and offset printing did not have the capabilities to maintain perfect color tones and small detail. Brodovich used this weakness to his advantage. He used black and white photography dynamically, not just laying out images after the fact. He changed the idea of what an art director was. He conceived ideas, the setting, and the look of the images. He was the mastermind behind all aspects of the layout. He fostered the talents of many of the best photographers of the time, like Richard Avedon and Irving Penn. Brodovich moved the traditional magazine layout away from a centered, stodgy approach with small illustrations to asymmetrical, dynamic, and photographic solutions. Over time, his power increased as an art director, while the layouts became increasingly minimal. If you've ever seen the movie Funny Face, watch for the scene with the angry Russian art director. He's based on Alexei Brodovich. The change from a dense, text-filled magazine from the 1920s to a highly illustrated and energetic one profoundly changed the concept of a magazine. The incredible work of Seppi Pinelli's Joseph Binder and Alexei Brodovich at Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and 17 introduced modernist ideas and the European avant-garde to the United States. These magazines, however, reached only a small elite audience. The average American in the midst of the Great Depression did not need luxury items, expensive cruises, or couture fashion. Unemployment during the Depression was as high as 25%. Franklin Roosevelt initiated a new federal program, the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The WPA employed millions of Americans. They built dams, bridges, roads, and federal buildings. One division, the Federal Art Project, employed designers, illustrators, photographers, sculptors, and painters. The Federal Art Project introduced modernism to a wider audience in America through posters. Designers were urged to speak to the masses in the least elitist way possible. Imagery was representational, but not overly realistic. The subject matter ranged from travel posters to local art exhibitions. The program maintained the arts in the United States and began a tradition of public arts projects. Many of the WPA designers had been exposed to European modernism. The Bauhaus approach was geared to speak to a small group of European designers and was not effective in reaching millions of Americans. WPA designers integrated the simple forms and geometric shapes with clear iconography and symbols. Pure colors were easier to reproduce with offset and silkscreen printing, and communicated hope and progress. Lester Beale's poster for the Rural Electrification Administration are a great example of complex messages reduced to geometry and symbols. In 1935, 90% of America's rural areas had no electricity. Beale was tasked through the WPA to convince people in these areas to adopt electricity. He used silhouetted photography, icons such as arrows, and radically simplified shapes such as the water faucet on this poster. Beale designed posters that left no doubt to the message. His poster with arrows and the word radio make it clear immediately that electricity will bring radio to your home in red, white, and blue. In addition to the WPA's influence, most of the designers associated with the Bauhaus or modern ideas fled Germany to the United States. American designers began to see firsthand these ideas in action and adopted many of the forms. Joseph Binder's poster for the 1939 World's Fair exaggerates the scale of the monuments. The asymmetrical layout expresses energy by rotating the subject at an angle and using dramatic lighting. The poster is a series of repeating forms. The triangle of the trilon is echoed with the spotlights. The perisphere's circle is used for the walkway, and the typography serves as a grounding element. Paul Rand took the modernist concepts and applied them with a lighter touch. This catalog for design students at the 1939 World's Fair uses the simple geometry of the constructivists, but adds a layer of humor by referring to the fair's famous landmarks, the trilon and perisphere, with basic design elements. Paul Rand's cover for Apparel Arts magazine is influenced by Moholy Nagy's experimental photography at the Bauhaus. Rand, however, lightens the tone with a loose engraving of a palm tree echoing the boat propeller. European modernism began in Germany and evolved in the United States. The ideas and values remain the same, but the purpose was now to communicate complex ideas or to promote products to a wider audience than ever before. The result was a kinder, gentler modernism for the American way of life. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. The Nazi Party then began to eliminate all political opposition and consolidate their power with a campaign of violence and intimidation. They immediately began a mass media campaign to rule the German people. By 1934, the Nazi propaganda machine now controlled all communications from radio to posters. Joseph Goebbels was the head of the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda. He used film, books, and graphic design to communicate the Nazis' twisted set of values. Goebbels was one of Hitler's most devoted followers. He was extremely anti-Semitic and strongly supported the extermination of all European Jews. He commissioned work that spoke to ideas of Aryan racial purity and inherent German superiority over the world and anti-Semitism. In its early years, the Nazi Party adopted many of the modernist ideas, such as simple messages, iconography, and strong forms. However, as time passed, this changed to a more traditional and illustrative approach that Hitler preferred. By the mid-1930s, the typography was regulated to only using the official Germanic black-letter typefaces. Most of the modernist designers had either fled to other countries or were imprisoned in concentration camps. Other designers used sentimental and emotional scenes to manipulate the audience. On this poster, a young Aryan youth looks to the future, with the all-seeing Führer leading the way. Hitler was glorified in a godlike religious way. Abstract and geometric shapes were replaced by the realistic yet idealized illustrations. German citizens were forced to hang these posters in their homes to prove loyalty to the party. Others were plastered around the city. Nazi soldiers, Hitler Youth, and German athletes were relentlessly portrayed as pure and Aryan. They are good-looking, white, Teutonic, and strong. This poster has a halo background to communicate the purity of a young woman. Or we see a soldier from below, making him seem grand and heroic. A poster by Ludwig Holbein for an athletic event gives us an image of the perfect German woman, athletic, strong, vigorous, tanned, and Aryan. She represents victory, energy, and vitality, ideas valued by the Nazis. The message is problematic, ethically, but compositionally, it is a success. Holbein takes the color and shape of her shorts to echo the swastika. The form of her body echoes the shape of the flag. The primary idea in all propaganda is to characterize your side as heroic and the enemy as subhuman. If we see an enemy as an individual with feelings and a life, we may feel empathy. The Nazi posters used extreme and grotesque characterizations of racial minorities, Jews, Americans, and the British. The Imperial Japanese propaganda illustrates President Roosevelt as a green Frankenstein monster. Spreads in this Japanese book show images of the peaceful harmony in Manchuria during its brutal occupation. At the end of World War II, the Nazi regime faced defeat. Even then, Goebbels persisted in the faith that propaganda would lead to victory. This poster for the Volkssturm, or People's Militia, communicated the message that every German male between 13 and 60 should fight until dead. In April 1945, the Allied powers won the war. Hitler and Goebbels committed suicide and left a shattered nation to rebuild. The result of the Nazi purges of intellectuals and artists eliminated an entire generation of Germany's best minds and designers. The tools of propaganda have been consistent for centuries. Nazis elevated propaganda to a new level by using mass communication to spread their terrible message. During World War II, the Allied powers included Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. In contrast to the Nazi messages of intimidation, fear, anti-Semitism, and racial purity, Britain and the United States utilized propaganda to mobilize national spirit, appeal to patriotic duty, and encourage hard work. In the same way that the message of the Axis powers evolved from a ruthless set of Nazi values, the Allied messages were reflected from a national set of ethics that valued freedom, liberty, and a democratic society. In January 1941, President Roosevelt articulated his vision for a post-war world founded on 4 basic human freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Norman Rockwell used these ideas as the basis of World War II's best example of Allied propaganda, the 4 freedoms. Initially, Rockwell had no idea how to tackle such large and broad ideas. Then he decided to tell the story from the point of view of his own hometown. While these posters may seem traditional and representative, they incorporate many of the modernist concepts. Specific symbols are included to strengthen the message. Perspective is skewed to create room for the elements. And there are no parts of the poster that do not contribute to the message. In freedom of speech, the blue-collar worker speaks at a town meeting with the same rights as the white-collar executive next to him. Freedom from fear depicts the father holding a newspaper with wartime headlines, while his wife tucks the children in bed. The warm light of home is represented with a small vertical band on the far right. Freedom from want gives us the bounty of Thanksgiving. Not of food, but of family. The man in the front looking directly at you, the viewer, as part of the family. The shape of the couple serving echoes the shape of the turkey, and the food on the table represents the goodness of American agriculture. Other designers and illustrators focused on the value of work, such as J. Howard Miller's Rosie the Riveter, which served as a morale booster for the war effort in factories. Rosie's red, white, and blue attire reinforces the patriotic communication. Jean Carlu, originally from France, brought modernist and European avant-garde to his American work with simplified shapes and iconic imagery. His poster for America's Answer production used less literal illustrations, taking a graphic approach to convey the message with symbols. The letter O does double service as a nut turned by a highly stylized wrench. Joseph Binder's Army Air Corps poster is a combination of simple geometry and patriotic colors which highlight the energy of flight. The tiny airplanes pointing toward the American star is the key element depicting enormous height and distance. One of my favorite posters from any period is Charles Coyner's poster, Give It Your Best. It is a direct and simple depiction of the American flag with a declarative command. The command and simple message are similar to the World War I poster, I Want You. Optimism, teamwork, and challenge are exemplified in every Allied message. The War Department worked across media to convey these messages from radio to movies. Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph of Marines and a naval corpsman raising the flag on Iwo Jima was quickly reused as a poster, encouraging all the forces to work in unison. The war effort in the United States provided a need for mass communication and manipulation of message. These skills, combined with the immigration of European designers in the 1930s, created some of the most successful and copied posters in history. Going forward, after the war, these tools would be used again as a post-war economy boomed. World War II left much of Europe and large parts of Asia in ruin. The continental United States was untouched. During the war, the U.S. industrial machine expanded dramatically following the Great Depression. These factors made America the world's dominant economic and military power. In addition, millions of troops were demobilized and absorbed back into the economy. Now, with wartime restrictions on purchasing removed, the consumer market exploded. Many graphic designers were among these demobilized troops. They had seen the world and were not willing to return to traditional or expected solutions. They viewed the world as a new frontier and wanted to explore new ways of communicating. The ideas of modernism integrated into mainstream design. Now the public wanted fresh, new, clean, and simple solutions for graphic design, architecture, and products. Rather than religiously adopting the strict Bauhaus methods of modernism, designers such as Paul Rand, Lester Beale, Saul Bass, Lou Danziger, and Alvin Lustig used the Bauhaus concepts as a stylistic approach. Simplicity and a less is more approach was employed, but exuberant colors and forms replaced the clinical perfection of disciplined modernism. This was also a time of great ideas and confidence. Walter Pepke, an executive at the Container Corporation of America, helped form the American Bauhaus in Chicago. He founded the International Design Conference in Aspen and was responsible for promoting graphic designers with the Container Corporation advertising. Rather than showing a product, in this case cardboard boxes, Pepke invited designers to use great ideas of Western man for advertising content. The solution by Paul Rand uses the Uncle Sam hat as a fused metaphor of a flower pot to convey the flowering of liberty and democracy. The loose illustration style conveys energy and a personal connection to the subject. Post-war America was a place where science, industry, and the American spirit of invention had saved the world and would make a new one. American corporations were trusted leaders, technology was idolized, and the atom was our friend. Alvin Lustig's cover for ID magazine connects three very different items within the common shape of a circle. The primary colors are derived from the De Stijl movement, while the photomontage comes from Bauhaus experimental photography. Iconography and symbols replaced text-driven messages. Organic shapes replaced the hard-edged forms of the warriors. Herbert Bayer used fluid shapes as abstract talk bubbles. Herbert Matter, another European who immigrated to the United States in the 1930s, encased images of new furniture from Knoll in biomorphic shapes. The negative space here is as critical as the positive shape. Many wartime production methods evolved into consumer products. Tupperware, molded plywood, nylons, and a host of other products entered the marketplace. Alvin Lustig's ad for a new line of chairs focuses on the organic shape of the molded plywood rather than just the chair. Color palettes move from the drab tones of camouflage to vibrant and optimistic colors. Pastel and bright colors were favored. Printing technology was less accurate than today, and the simpler tones, like a solid magenta, reproduce better than a subtle and complex color. Graphic design emerged as a profession in the 1950s. Before the war, graphic designers were considered commercial artists or art directors. AIGA, the American Institute of Graphic Arts, was founded in 1914 by typographers and printers. In the 1950s, the organization changed with leaders who were now called graphic designers. The way we digest information as a culture forces design to evolve. In the Victorian era, when books were the primary modes of communication, design was dense and relied on text. In the 1920s, radio changed that, and as we heard information in a more sequential way, typography opened up and became more dynamic. By the 1950s, television and film revolutionized our society dramatically. And design responded. Design evolved from a primarily text-based solution in the 19th century, where text and pattern were the only elements for communication, to solutions in the 1930s that combined text and image, using both the image and typography to tell the story. And then, by the 1950s, designers used a singular image as the primary element. The image, however, wasn't simply a pretty picture. It needed to communicate an idea and tell the entire story. Symbols and metaphorical images are strong ways to telegraph an idea. A symbol of a heart is fairly universal and is faster to read than words. Designers use the power of symbols as a technique to use images in place of complex verbiage. In the 1950s, many designers employed the concept of a fused metaphor. This takes one image, a film strip for example, that is a symbol for film or movies, and combines it with a series of flags that communicate international. When fused, the two symbols read together and tell the story without needing to read the copy. The most successful solutions merged the two symbols and created something new. Think of it as 1 + 1 = 3. This is Paul Rand's cover for an exhibition of modern art in daily life. He takes the symbol of a paint palette and paintbrush to read his art. Then he combines them with a fork, turning the paint palette into a plate. A complex idea like modern art in daily life is told quickly and surprisingly. One of the most exquisite examples of this approach is Lou Danziger's catalog cover for an exhibition of American paintings. A paintbrush is paired with the gesture of an American flag. The simple white background, minimal typography, and black and white paintbrush are paired with not a perfect image of the American flag, but with the painted version of one, relating back to the subject matter. The genius of this approach is the interaction with the viewer. When he or she sees the solution, they need to decode it. They are riddles that may take a few seconds to understand. The more time the viewer spends with the image, the better they will remember it. And the discovery of the meaning provides a sense of delight, as in, of course, now I get it. Chermayeff and Geismar designed a series of covers for architectural and engineering news, using the fused metaphor approach. Like Danziger's American painting cover, the issue for the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. removes any complex background and uses a flag and architect's drafting pencil. Their covers for Pepsi Cola World are lively and humorous, asking the viewer to solve the riddle, then providing the answer with a small type for the month of the year. A collection of bottle caps and football play diagram can only mean Pepsi Cola and football season. This is a solution that is still viable today and can create surprising and unexpected results. Make a list of symbols for one subject and a list for another, and combine them one by one. Lunch and art, for example. The strength of this image-driven approach is evidence of the wider gap between advertising and graphic design that began in the 1950s. Designers began to drop the slogan and turn directly to image-based solutions that didn't rely on words. Advertising was, and still is, dominated by copy and taglines. The standard ad composition was to show an image, place a slogan below it, and copy to support the product. One way is not better than another. Done well, either approach can be sublime. The fused metaphor answered the public's desire to read images rather than text. As television and film became the dominant communications media, it was clear that the second half of the 20th century would be the age of images. In the 1950s and 60s, New York was the center of advertising and design. The term the New York School is more about a group of designers working in and around New York rather than a strong creative movement. A common theme of these designers is a commitment to the modernist ideas of less is more, functionalism, and the use of images and geometric forms to convey a message. The American iteration of this placed importance on work being egalitarian, open, and direct. These designers took advantage of common cultural symbols. They combined them with verbiage to tell a new story, creating a symbiotic relationship between word and image. Henry Wolf's cover for a catalog on an AIGA exhibition of paperback covers shows the viewer a trompe-l'oeil tear revealing the word paperback, which is, of course, exactly what that is. Bradbury Thompson's incredible promotional books for the paper company Westvaco integrate collage, experimental printing techniques, and asymmetrical typography with classical American images and themes. Paul Rand's cover for a book on Pablo Picasso takes the artistic personality of Picasso's brushstrokes and integrates a portrait of him into the composition. This creates a double meaning for the title, a portrait of the artist and a portrait of his work. Much of this work used a clever twist on a common image. The upside to this approach was a fast read that provided a sense of delight and positive connection to the brand or product. The vision behind CBS, William Golden, used a flag at half-mast as a symbol for the death of someone of prominence. The answer here, made clear by the headline, is how the vice president can become the president. The tenet in modernism, less is more, makes this work. Every element from the image to typeface contributes to the communication. If George Czerny had added too many elements, fussy typography, or decorative devices, the message would be unclear. Designers also used alternative methods of making to create a stronger message. We are so used to a world of photographs that it is hard to consider a rough drawing or collage as a viable solution. Even though he was in Los Angeles, Saul Bass is typically included in the New York school. Bass used cut paper, collage, and a variety of tools. His poster for The Man with the Golden Arm is made of cut paper and hand-drawn typography. The result is one of the most famous movie posters in history. Bass also used humor to suggest an idea that might be too risque. The poster for Love in the Afternoon doesn't show a literal image of people engaged in an illicit activity. Bass suggests the naughtiness with a hand closing the blind, the first step if one were to have an affair in the afternoon. The defining ideas of the New York school, simplicity, honesty, humor, and intelligence, echoed the American culture of the 1950s and early 60s. These designers took the tenets of modernism and techniques of the European avant-garde and created a new language. This version of Bauhaus modernism had now matured into a confident and dynamic approach, reflecting the values of the time and place, and creating a truly American form of design. After the war, the international style, or Swiss typography, predominated European graphic design. It was a style that relied on order, mathematical proportions, and a rigid grid structure. In the same way that Dutch culture influenced de stijl with order and a Calvinist discipline, Switzerland's national character influenced the international style. A preference for clarity and structure based on rigid rules led to Swiss typography. In 1957, Joseph Müller-Brockmann began teaching typography and graphic design in Zurich. His work was founded on strict proportional guidelines, primarily the golden section. A grid structure was used to organize elements. Typography and visual elements were scaled mathematically rather than intuitively. He founded and co-edited Die Neue Grafik, or the New Graphic Design Journal. This was written in German, English, and French, and broadened Müller-Brockmann's approach internationally. Many of Jan Tschichol's ideas from the Bauhaus influenced designers in Switzerland, such as Müller-Brockmann, Armin Hofmann, Ernst Keller, and Max Bill. These ideas included that typography should be dynamic and functional. A designer needed only a single sans-serif typeface, such as Accidents Grotesque. A flush left, ragged right alignment was preferred. The difference from Tschichold was the rigorous devotion to the golden section and mathematical systems. Some designers superimposed the golden section on the camera lens so the models and objects would line up perfectly in the frame. The strongest work was dynamic and piercing. Simple geometric forms were scaled and placed with meticulous and mathematical precision. Color was used either sparingly to highlight information, or create a focal point, or as large color fields. The main goal of any piece was functional. The message should be clear and ordered for the viewer to comprehend. Black and white photography was straightforward, objective, and sharp, existing only to service the composition and message. From the success of Müller-Brockmann's journal Die Neue Grafik, the Swiss style moved into the rest of Europe and crossed the Atlantic to America. Antonio Boggeri founded Studio Boggeri in Milan in 1933. Moholy-Nagy and the work of the Bauhaus inspired Boggeri's solutions. By the 1950s, he adopted many of the ideas of Swiss typography. Unlike Müller-Brockmann, Boggeri's work had a looser approach. The golden section and grids were still apparent, but there was a lighter touch and a willingness to break the rules if it made for a better composition. American and Canadian designers treated Swiss typography the same way they dealt with Bauhaus modernism. It was one of many styles and used with a range of clients. A grid might be present on a layout, but some elements might shift if the designer determined it created more impact, as in this poster by Arnold Sachs. The international style dominated architecture and design throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. But as less talented architects and designers began using the style, the results became banal and dull. Today, we take for granted that we set up a grid for a layout, use the golden section as proportion, and maintain mathematical consistency with type sizes. These are all the result of Swiss typography. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the American corporation was viewed as leading the way toward a great, big, beautiful tomorrow. Corporations embodied the values of the 1950s: conformity, order, hierarchical power structures, and security. Employees expected to work at the same corporation for their entire career. With hard work, they would climb the corporate ladder from the mailroom to the CEO, slowly providing a better life for their family. Before the 1950s, corporate identity was a rather casual affair. Divisions often created their own version of a logo and were autonomous in their design choices. A group of 10 executives might have 10 distinctly different letterhead designs. As corporations grew and expanded, the lack of visual consistency became a problem. Creating a cohesive identity program solved multiple problems. Functionally, for example, an entire company now used one business card or letterhead design. This allowed for centralized purchasing of printing and reducing costs. In marketing, one logo and visual style maintained a clear and unified message in a competitive landscape. Logos designed in the 1950s and 60s were hard-edged and simple. Reproduction quality was variable from a well-printed brochure to a low-end newspaper ad. Sharp and clean forms worked best across the spectrum. Saul Bass's identity for the Bell system, which became AT&T, is a good example of the progressive simplification that evolved into a masterful icon. A corporate identity system expanded a designer's role from only designing a logo to creating an overall branded look. Chimaev and Geismar designed the Mobil logo in 1963. The previous name, Mobil Gas, was shortened, and the simple logo was the foundation for a major overhaul of all corporate communications, advertising, and signage. An identity program could unify thousands of employees and increase stock values. It could reposition a company in a new medium like the CBS identity designed by William Golden in 1951. As he was driving through Pennsylvania Dutch country, he was inspired by the hex symbols in the shape of a human eye painted on Shaker barns. The new mark moved CBS from radio broadcasting to television. After Golden died in 1959, Lou Dorfman took over as creative director. He evolved the identity with a singular typeface, CBS Dido, and a black and white palette. Dorfman proved that a strong identity system could be varied and exciting across a wide range of materials. Paul Rand designed several of the period's most recognizable marks. The IBM logo evolved from the former full name of International Business Machines. Rand recognized the power of a more efficient approach, the shortened acronym. He continued this idea with the American Broadcasting Company, which uses the same ABC logo 50 years later. The mark is a series of almost identical circles in the negative spaces, the letter forms, and the containing shape. The simplicity is one of the reasons for its longevity. Rand's UPS logo also shortened the United Parcel Service to an easier name and used a simple rectangle and bow shape to communicate parcels. Large-scale identity systems introduced the Identity Manual. These guidelines maintained a cohesive system with a set of rules for usage. They were distributed to creative departments and outside agencies to maintain a singular vision. Some corporations went to extremes to maintain a cohesive voice. In one instance, all executives were required to wear white shirts and black ties. No personal artifacts were allowed on a desk, and a template existed to make sure everyone's desk lamp was at the exact same angle. Questions about the dehumanizing aspects of the corporation gained momentum by the late 1950s. The idea that a corporation was the key to a golden future began to disintegrate. The monolithic aspect of a rigid corporate identity system began to evolve. Political activism has been a part of graphic design for centuries. We use images or symbols and words to convey our point of view. This is the constant in our profession. Benjamin Franklin did it with his printing press, hippies did it in the 1960s, and we do it today. In order to understand the 1960s, we need to go back to World War II. During the war, women and minorities experienced new freedoms. Women were told they were strong enough to be in the workplace building ships and airplanes, and everyone was called on to do his or her part regardless of race, religion, or gender. After the war, this changed. Millions of troops were demobilized and absorbed back into the economy. This meant that everyone else was told to go back to the old ways. Women belonged in the home. Racial minorities were segregated, and anyone thinking differently was disenfranchised. But you can't put people back in a box. By the mid-1960s, society exploded. Graphic designers used their skills to communicate issues around civil rights, the anti-war movement, the environment, and women's issues. The design of protest worked best when it was direct and to the point, with little chance of misinterpretation. Mikado Wada's poster, protesting the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, uses clear symbols of the American flag and a dead Vietnamese man. The rough illustration technique made the message more visceral and emotional. In France, a series of strike posters by Atelier Populaire are roughly drawn silkscreen silhouettes. The handmade typography adds to the urgency, and the red color connects to socialism. Seymour Quast's anti-war poster uses the recognizable symbol of Uncle Sam from the James Montgomery Flag World War I poster and recasts him as a villain. Non-designers also created much of the protest work. These flyers, posters, and publications were printed on small presses or mimeograph copiers in someone's garage. The point was not high-end aesthetics and refinement, but the urgency of the message. Slick graphics were identified as being mainstream or Madison Avenue establishment. A new, raw aesthetic emerged that treated design as an ephemeral messaging tool rather than a piece of art. In 1967, a satellite captured the first image of the Earth from space. The writer, Stuart Brand, used this image on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog. The catalog provided information on sustainable practices and living communally. The image and catalog sparked the environmental movement. It's common practice today to recycle, use natural resources judiciously, and support environmental issues. But it was a radical concept in 1968. John Van Hamersveld addressed the issue with a poster highlighting the air quality in Southern California in 1970. And other designers used the poster to forward the anti-establishment idea of recycling. Protest work depends on an emotional response. Like propaganda, complex information cannot convince the viewer of anything. Work from the 1960s used a sense of community, outrage, and us against them. Even dating was used as a way to convince young men to burn their draft cards. The influence of this period permeates every part of our life now. From zines to protest stickers on Facebook, the counterculture movement created an environment where we freely use graphic design to clarify our unique position on any subject. San Francisco was the port where many young men and women were discharged after World War II. Those that didn't feel that they fit in back on the farm or the small town stayed. The Beat movement grew in the 1950s, and the city became a haven for artists and writers. By 1966, San Francisco was the epicenter of the counterculture revolution. A small group of designers began making posters to promote events at the Fillmore Auditorium in 1966. The posters followed a style that was fluid and complex. Any poster from this time period and style is grouped together as a Fillmore poster. It's important to realize that this was the height of the American corporate identity, Swiss typography, and international style. But the Fillmore posters are 180 degrees from these. We look at these today and think, how can anyone read that? The point, at the time, was to reject legible Swiss modernism in favor of a more organic and less rigid experience. This was also amplified by the use of hallucinogenic drugs and other substances. The idea was, frankly, to take these drugs and stare at a poster for hours. There was a strong connection to the ideas of Art Nouveau. In the same way that Art Nouveau designers rejected the cold idea of the industrial age, the Fillmore poster designers rejected hard-edge modernism and consumer-driven culture. There are stylistic connections to Art Nouveau and conceptual connections to 19th century writers like Lewis Carroll. Books like Carroll's Alice in Wonderland are filled with mind-altering drugs. Placards with Jefferson Airplane's lyrics, based on Alice's story, promoted drug usage. The Leidenthal poster for Big Brother and the Holding Company takes the Cheshire Cat from Alice as a nod to drugs. Much of the work was silk-screened or printed on small presses. It was often turned around quickly. The demands created a unique set of circumstances that allowed for exploration and experimentation. Typography was typically hand-drawn. This solved two problems. The first being the difficulty to obtain typesetting, which was expensive. The second being a personal and organic approach. The color palettes are rarely polite. The colors vibrate and clash, often creating optical illusions. Again, this was a response to the viewer who was taking LSD, and the designer who was typically designing while on LSD. The Fillmore poster movement became the look of a new generation. The style implied a new consciousness and a rejection of the old and traditional ways. Young people began putting these posters on their walls as a symbol of unity. For the first time, posters were designed to be viewed in a personal rather than public setting. Like all movements, the counterculture evolved and eventually disappeared. Once advertisers noticed the youth market's connection to this, they began using it to sell products. The idea of dropping out, which was a way of suggesting that one would leave school or a job and live off the land, was modified to be a selling point for soda drinks and washing detergent by the early 1970s. The value of this work for me is the exuberant approach to typography and color. No two colors are ever wrong, and type can or cannot be legible. These radical ideas open the door for all alternative graphic design today. While much of the design world in the 1960s and 1970s embraced Swiss modernism and Helvetica, another group of designers turned to an eclectic and exuberant approach. Unlike the Fillmore posters, this work was rooted in ideas of decoration, expressive form, and the human touch rather than rebellion and drugs. Again, technology is a strong component of the shift. In the 1960s, photo typesetting became the prevalent way of getting type. For decades, designers ordered type that was set in metal. Now, a system existed that used a negative and film technology to generate letter forms. This opened the door to typeface designs that could never be made in metal because they were too thin, too heavy, or too elaborate. Now with photo typesetting, the finest of hairline rules, ultra-tight letter spacing, and highly complex letter forms could be generated and used by a designer. Like the Fillmore posters, the eclectic movement also looked back to Victorian and Art Deco forms. These had been deemed bad design for the generation following Bauhaus modernism. But many designers began to feel boxed in by minimal Swiss modernism and wanted to work with other styles and a more humanist approach. Now, led by designers like Herb Lubalin, designers look back and integrated these styles into their work. This wasn't simply a copying of a Victorian design. The best solutions took the forms and images and repurposed them for a contemporary audience. A magazine spread by Lubalin adopts 19th century typography and ornament and adapts it with a modernist grid and vibrant color. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the layouts became more and more elaborate, and the typefaces more extreme. The overly decorative and exaggerated forms shocked most of the design establishment. A split began between the modernists and designers rejecting those hardline rules. Illustration began to replace photography as a way of embracing a warmer, less clinical and functional tone. Pushpin Studios adopted Art Deco, Art Nouveau, and other historical forms and mixed illustration with typography. Typographic eclecticism was never meant to be elitist or considered high art. Designers like Herb Lubalin in New York and Margaret Larson in San Francisco considered Swiss typography to be aimed at a small elite, while typographic eclecticism was warmer and appealed to a wider mass audience. Like the Fillmore posters, this idea opened the doors to a wide variety of design movements to follow. Rejecting functionalism, embracing personal expression, mixing media, and appropriating forms from other time periods became components of the postmodern movement and dominated design in the 1980s. Album cover design is an area often overlooked by design historians. The subject matter was music, not intellectual concepts. There was no philosophical manifesto. It was an art form that existed to sell records. If you ask anyone who lived during the time when people actually bought records, they will light up when discussing their favorite record and be able to describe the cover in detail. Great emotional weight is contained with the combination of personal involvement with the music and the artifact of the album cover. The designers of the late 1960s and 1970s working in this field were a special breed. They were the first rock star graphic designers. Other designers knew them by name, and they were promoted along with the covers. The styles were loose and open-ended. One cover might be modernist and simple, another complex and decorative. There was no attachment to a specific idea. Each solution might be radically different from the last. The industry thrived in Los Angeles and New York, the two centers of the music industry. Designers such as Roland Young produced an enormous body of work. The freewheeling approach of the 1970s is evident in the mix of media, style, and ideas. Budgets were large, and a designer could hire the best illustrators and photographers. Unique packaging techniques were added as the album covers became more than simply a way to hold a record. Most album covers depict the band name and a photograph of the band or musician. The best examples of album cover design rely on abstraction or symbols. This may seem easy, but removing a photo of the band was a difficult battle with the artists, agents, record companies, and executives. But when it was possible, great results emerged. The emotional connection to a physical artifact is lost with MP3 downloads. These great album covers prove the power of design to reach the viewer as an individual. The rejection of following one dogma explicitly makes sense after the radical changes of the 1960s. The album cover provided a perfect vehicle for personal connection to design, as the decade moved from being the we generation of the 60s to the me generation of the 70s. Previous to World War II, Japan had remained fairly isolated and traditional. After World War II, the MacArthur Plan revived the Japanese economy and introduced social changes. Modernity and technology was embraced. By the 1960s, Japanese design reflected an integration of Western ideas into a Japanese aesthetic. In some instances, this was expressed with Swiss modernism. Gan Hosaya used the Golden Section, Swiss typography, and Helvetica for a Yamaha motorcycle poster. The purely Swiss approach is adapted, however, by turning the image on the vertical, using an aspect of Japanese writing. From the mid-1960s to the 1970s, a new Japanese aesthetic emerged. It maintained ties to Swiss modernism and a preference for neutral geometric forms. Japanese techniques such as flattened shapes and high contrast were combined with a connection to mathematical proportions and minimal symbols. Ryoichi Yamashiro's tree planting poster demonstrates integrating Japanese traditions and incorporating international influences. He uses Japanese calligraphy and spatial composition with a more conceptual way, perhaps influenced by Western communication. After World War II, Yusaka Kamakura emerged as an influential design leader in Japan. He was nicknamed Boss in Japanese by the Tokyo design community. Kamakura worked tirelessly to change the idea that the applied art, such as graphic design, was inferior to fine art. He founded the Japan Advertising Club and strengthened the position of graphic design as a professional discipline. His poster for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics is a masterpiece of simplicity and concept. It connects to European modernism with flat geometry and symbolism, but adopts a Japanese approach to symmetry. Kamakura's poster for Expo 70 combines the language of traditional Japanese crests with expressive geometry and Western sans serif typography. The result is modern, harmonious, and cohesive. Iko Tanaka created imagery and iconography with rigid grid structures and color fields. He took the expected imagery from Japanese culture, such as a geisha or samurai, and reimagined it with modern geometry. Tadanori Yoku combined the psychedelic approach of Fillmore posters with Japanese symbols and forms. Western iconography, such as Marilyn Monroe, yachts, and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., are used with traditional Japanese woodblock techniques and text. Yoku also manages space with traditional Japanese composition. Objects at the top of the frame are the most distant, and objects at the bottom are the closest to the viewer. After World War II, Japan rose from defeat to become a global leader in technology and manufacturing. Graphic design in Japan matched this rise, moving from a secondary trade in 1950 to a well-respected profession by 1990. Contemporary Japanese design combined the traditions and methods of Japan with modern ideas. The result was a fresh aesthetic that was both rational and intuitive simultaneously. Swiss typography and the international style were the dominant forms of design in the 1960s and 1970s. The rigid adherence to strict mathematical proportions and rational typography created neutral and refined work. But there was no allowance for anything unexpected, intuitive, or playful. By the mid-1960s, a younger group of Swiss designers began to slowly break some of the rules. Swiss designers such as Steph Geisbuehler and Rosemary Tisi had seen the typographic eclecticism of the 1960s in the United States. They were influenced by the freedom and exuberance and began to expand the rules of Swiss design. Geisbuehler explored the complexity of form rather than rigid simplicity, and the layering of form and space. His solutions merged motion and dimension with information and concept. At Basel, in Switzerland, Wolfgang Weingart explored typography by questioning all of the rules. why was it wrong to change the weight of a typeface mid-sentence? Were there different ways to create hierarchy with open letter spacing, angles, and unexpected composition? Weingart then used film positives and negatives and typography to overlap information and texture. He exposed the process and showed the halftone dots, cut lines, and typographic accidents. After a series of presentations in the United States, a new generation of designers went to Basel to study with Weingart. Dan Friedman, April Greiman, and Willy Kunz studied with Weingart, then returned to the United States. Greiman moved to Los Angeles and integrated a California energy into her work. A promotion for the China Club creates typographic three-dimensional space. Letter spacing, different weights and sizes suggest type and typographic elements that are forward or more distant in space. Willy Kunz's poster for Columbia University maintains the language of Swiss modernism, but introduces shape, pattern, and three-dimensional space to clarify the message. The result is a synthesis of refinement and order with a vibrant energy and the unexpected. Deborah Sussman's environmental design for the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles adopted many of the ideas of the New Wave. An underpinning of Swiss modernism, three-dimensional typography, and a preference for geometric shapes. She added to this by running it through a filter of vibrant color. The color palettes were inspired from Mexican, South American, and Asian influences rather than European models. The New Wave movement combined the functionalism of the Bauhaus, energy of constructivism, and the rigor of Swiss modernism. The addition of radical experimentation, expressive typography, and a high-tech color palette created the movement. More importantly, it introduced a new approach that accepted intuition and play. The United States is a big country. One idea can be influencing graphic design in one region, while another idea is prevalent in another. Seattle in the late 1980s and 90s was a nexus of amazing energy and movement in music and design. As the music scene exploded, the design world responded and created a unique style specific to that time and place. The designer Art Chantry moved to Seattle in the 1970s. He worked as an art director at a free monthly tabloid and began designing posters for independent record labels, community events, and concerts. The posters typically had low budgets and tight turnaround times. Chantry used this to his advantage and adopted a process that combined found images from vintage magazines and books with bold typography. This related to the music scene. The musicians in Washington wore thrift store items and the typical outdoor clothing. The style did not evolve out of a conscious attempt to create an appealing fashion. It was about being cheap and durable and appealed to those focused on authenticity in their music. A poster for an exhibition of artist-made machines combines the low-tech typography of a handheld label machine with the intentionally rough image of a tire. The handmade and raw visuals convey energy and an alternative experience. Chantry's remarkable sense of composition and scale works here, making a strong and clear poster. Robin Ray and Michael Strasburger founded Modern Dog Design in 1987. Modern Dog employed many of the same techniques of found imagery, raw typography, and a sense of immediacy. Ray and Strasburger included a wry sense of humor to much of the work, and an attitude of, we like it, and that's what matters. The imagery was taken not from high-end photography, but from parts of low-end culture, such as a 1970s catalog from Sears. There were multiple messages built into each piece. These posters do not adhere to the fused metaphor school, Bauhaus modernism, or typographic eclecticism. Here, less was not more, less was a bore. The success of this work is its lack of self-importance. These are ephemeral items that will be used and discarded. They don't carry the weight of being high art or precious. They are energetic, raw, and unapologetic. By the mid-1970s, modernism seemed to have run its course. The philosophy of rational, objective, and rule-oriented design didn't answer the needs of a generation interested in self-expression and intuition. Graphic designers began exploring ideas such as decoration, pop culture, and historical classical forms. The term applied to this is postmodernism. Postmodernism is a complex subject. Entire sections of libraries are devoted to books on the idea. But there are a few constants in graphic design. Rejecting the tenets of modernism, form does not follow function. Design can be expressive and ignore the function. Elements can be appropriated from anywhere. Typography can be self-referential and have alternative meanings. Irony is a large component. The piece might borrow a form or idea from somewhere else and treat it satirically. Or it may be ironic itself, mimicking another piece of design. Architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown introduced the concept of vernacular design as a component of postmodernism in their book, Learning from Las Vegas. Vernacular design refers to the language of common design. In graphic design, rather than presenting the world in Helvetica, postmodern design borrowed from the language of the street. Typography borrowed from a car wash sign was as relevant as refined Caslon. A classical form was recycled in a new way. Michael Vanderbile's poster, Connections, contrasts a stylized classical column with a modern grid. The line of runners communicates a value of the pre-modernist ideas of classical harmony. Postmodern design incorporated a relentless attention to the written language. Words could be reconstructed to change meaning or broken apart to highlight a meaning. The representation of a word was more important than the information. For example, a poster by Stefan Sagmeister for an AIGA conference has typography made from chicken feet. Rather than simply being a word in chicken feet, the postmodern approach was to deconstruct the meaning of chicken feet letter forms. All work in the postmodern genre was designed to be analyzed from a historical, semiotic, and psychological point of view. The meaning of a collaged image, letter space typography, and colors was dissected and examined. To most viewers, postmodern design seemed friendlier and more humorous than the hardline Swiss modernism. The solutions were nostalgic and warm. The design world, however, deconstructed every element, reviewing the complex interplay of political and cultural meaning. In postmodern design, a rose was not just a rose. As the movement evolved, the playful connection of vernacular typography and appropriated imagery evolved into a niche conversation of the dystopia of the world aimed at a smaller and smaller audience. Design was poised for a split between those who maintained a focus on postmodern critical theory, primarily in academia, and those focused on the larger mass market in practice. In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh. I was in college, and Lou Danziger, one of my teachers, asked me to take it out of the box and see if we could use it. As it turns out, it could make typography. Since nobody was there to teach me the right way, I learned to use the mouse upside down. When the Mac was released, shockwaves ran through the entire profession. Some designers refused to touch it. A famous designer said he couldn't stand the smell of it. But the Mac would revolutionize the entire industry. The initial options were primitive, Helvetica or Times Roman, bitmapped images, and slow processing. As technology improved, the design solutions became more refined. Typically, when a new medium is introduced, it will try to emulate a previous form. Early photography tried to look painterly. Now designers tried to find language unique to the digital environment. Early work took the language of the medium, the bitmap, and exaggerated it. Images were pixelated or degenerated. Digital errors in typography were highlighted. The idea of accident and imperfection was incorporated into design. the digital medium enhanced the idea of new wave typography and three-dimensional space. Typography became radically three-dimensional and layered. A solution that would have required days of creating a complex mechanical with multiple layers of physical films could now be created and manipulated with ease. Scott Mackala's typographic treatments for a Michael and Janet Jackson video were revolutionary. The typeface with imperfections and exaggerated forms was animated dimensionally. The suggestion of three-dimensional typography was now a reality in a screen-based medium, motion. Many of the designers exploring the possibilities in the digital arena had embraced postmodernism and deconstruction. Lorraine Wild's poster for the Southern California Institute of Architecture was layered with an image, fine lines, and typography. The viewer was invited to reconstruct the meaning from the individual pieces. The digital revolution also created the democratization of design. Now, anyone from a designer to your mother could design an invitation, logo, or flyer. A clear split occurred between civilians, who now made low-end design such as an in-house newsletter, and high-end design created by trained designers. The ability to design fonts in a digital format created opportunities for exploration. Jeff Keaty's work maintained the highest level of typographic refinement and skill, but explored the way we read and the cultural meaning inherent in a typeface. Font design then moved from the control of a small group of highly trained experts to a discipline open to everyone. The upside being a proliferation of fonts, the downside being the lack of quality in many of them. Perhaps the most revolutionary shift in graphic design was the change from a designer as an art director to an editor and creator. The art director had traditionally been like an orchestra leader, pulling together photographers, illustrators, and typographers to make a solution. Now, the designer did all of these things in the digital box. There were more options than ever before. Rather than actively creating a solution, a designer now edited from a wide range of possibilities. As we've seen, graphic design responds to cultural, technological, or aesthetic changes. By the mid-1990s, a new generation of designers looked back at the complexity of postmodernism and the digital revolution and turned toward a simpler approach. Rather than following the idea of high-theory deconstruction, many of these designers were interested in creating work that spoke to a wider audience. They wanted to find a way of creating meaning with fewer forms. Many designers looked to return to singular ideas and minimal layouts. Referencing the work of the New York School in the 1950s, much of this had an air of optimism. Minimal work of the mid-1990s embraced simple geometry and clear color palettes. The idea of three-dimensional complexity in typography was abandoned in favor of easy-to-understand symbols and images. Legibility was a priority. But the concepts of postmodernism would not allow for retreat to a purely minimal Bauhaus approach. Now every image, symbol, and word was examined for its multiple meanings. Even the reference to a fused metaphor approach was filtered through the postmodern analysis. This cover for a conference catalog by Bill Grant appears to be a simple image of shopping carts and the word gain. The meaning, however, was far more complex. The shopping carts are at a Target store. The conference was in Minneapolis, home to Target's headquarters, and the conference was about commerce and society. A simple red typographic cover could not be just a simple cover. It was a reference to 1950s textbooks, vernacular design, and appropriation. The roots of minimalism were clearly based on the simple iconography of designers such as Paul Rand and James Massey. The complexity of the world, layered with massive amount of communication, on a daily basis created the need for a simpler way. Minimalism also escaped the trap of being dull. The explorations of expressive typography, Fillmore posters, and New Wave design extended the freedom to play with scale and negative space radically. The strongest solutions appeared playful and light. The reality, as in on this poster by Michael Vanderbijl, was a tight control over every element. With less on the page, everything mattered. The difference between a cover for a newsletter from the Bauhaus in 1928 and a minimalist poster from 1996 is a sense of self-knowledge. The 1928 cover is fresh and clear, and at the same time naive. The minimalist solution from the 1990s has the same fresh and clear dynamic, but is self-aware with understanding of 100 years of design history. When we discussed postmodernism, we touched on the idea of vernacular design. At its base definition, vernacular architecture speaks to the aesthetics related to a local region or building usage. A roadside motel is the vernacular of Route 66, or exposed pipes are the vernacular of a factory. In graphic design, this idea is about language. What is the language of the sign for the Route 66 motel? In the 1980s, Tibor Kalman founded M & Company in New York. He began playing with vernacular forms from low-end design such as a warehouse ad or street signage, as a contrast to the slick and cold modernism of corporate America. His design for an ad for Restaurant Florent borrowed typography from the street, diners, and a telephone book advertising. Kalman didn't replicate the typography to create a themed look. He reinterpreted it in a fresh new way. On a promotion for the same client, he appropriated an agricultural etching of a hog with a diagram of pork cuts and turns it into a map. The expected solution for a restaurant ad would have been to photograph the food and show a clean map typeset in Helvetica. The genius of Kalman was his willingness to reject that in favor of humor. Vernacular design was a way of celebrating low-end culture. The menu at Florent was a reference to non-designed menus at diners all over New York. Kalman adopted the elements creating the same look, but the skill of fine typography and smart copywriting elevated it to great design. Other solutions had a tongue-in-cheek attitude that winked at the original source. A poster for an exhibition on humorous graphic design appears to be a well-designed, expected solution with tasteful Bodoni and a well-photographed banana peel. Kalman shifts the entire poster to the right, revealing the printer's marks, suggesting a slip on a banana peel when the poster was trimmed. Other designers, such as Charles Spencer Anderson, incorporated multiple forms from a large range of sources. The complete covering of the entire poster rejects any three-dimensional typographic ideals or Swiss modernism. It was a wonderful overload of popular culture. This resulted in work that had a far warmer tone and spoke to a wider audience. The best work not only borrowed the typography and forms of low-end design, but also included smart or ironic messaging. It reinterpreted the language and made a new idea. Paul Ascher's posters for the public theater slammed together the language of street typography, constructivism, Dada, and wrestling posters. Again, the issue of modernist minimalism is rejected, reflecting the energy and vitality of the content. Vernacular design relied on two ideas. First, the audience would find a deeper connection with the recognition of the source. And second, if they didn't, it would still be appealing aesthetically. Several years ago, I judged a competition. One of the entries was a stationary system for a car wash. It was beautiful in its raw and naive form. But the question posed by vernacular design was this: was it intentionally raw and naive, or was it authentic? If it was authentic and not designed in an ironic way, did that make it less good? After World War II, many designers made the move from New York and Europe to the West Coast. Lou Danziger, Saul Bass, Walter Landor, Ray Eames, Alvin Lustig, and many others decided to build practices in Los Angeles and San Francisco. They saw the opportunity to work in new ways in a less crowded design marketplace. Isolation created community, In the early days, there were relatively few graphic designers working on the West Coast, and AIGA was a New York-based organization. Designers in Los Angeles and San Francisco gathered together in informal meetings or created groups such as the Designe group. At these meetings, they shared ideas and techniques. With less competition, they openly collaborated and worked as a whole to succeed. East Coast publications largely ignored the West Coast as being irrelevant. California-based magazines like Arts and Architecture and Communication Arts focused on the new work in California. The ethos of teaching was inherent in the California design scene since the 1940s. On the East Coast, teaching was a secondary profession that a designer might do after retiring, or something to do if one had extra time. In California, it was a given that education was integral to the profession. Art schools such as Art Center College of Design, California College of the Arts, and California Institute of the Arts followed the practice of educators being working designers. The ideas put forward in these schools were based on Bauhaus modernism and radical thinking. This led to a flourishing of work that was fresh and unexpected. Walter Landor founded Walter Landor & Associates in 1941. He initially worked with local clients in San Francisco, and then expanded into a client base along the entire Pacific Coast. By the late 1950s, Landor was an international leader in corporate identity. Landor's client base, beyond the United States, was Asia. This and its location, San Francisco, created a different atmosphere than the firms in New York. In 1964, Landor & Associates moved onto a retired ferry boat, the Klamath, permanently docked in San Francisco Bay. By the 1960s, designers like John Van Hamersveld and John Severson were designing posters for the surf culture. The surf and skate culture influenced designers with a casual attitude and DIY approach. These posters introduced concepts that would be used by the Fillmore posters in San Francisco and typographic eclecticism in New York a few years later. Margaret Larson and Barbara Stoffaker Solomon used color in vibrant and bold ways. They adopted color palettes that were connected more to Asia and South America than Europe. They rejected the Swiss approach to color as a purely functional element and painted with broad strokes. The entertainment industry provided an opportunity to work in different media. Saul Bass's film titles revolutionized movie making. His graphic and minimal sensibility created titles that are imitated to today. The title sequences for North by Northwest, The Man with a Golden Arm, and Psycho rely on a reductive set of elements and simple animation. The results were astounding. Interestingly, Bass and Alfred Hitchcock ended their collaboration after Psycho. Bass and Hitchcock both claimed they designed the shower sequence. It's the simple shapes like the shower head and graphic elements like the grid of tiles that indicate the hand of Bass. In the 1980s, the New Wave movement flourished in California. April Greiman's space and shape concepts and Deborah Sussman's work for the 1984 Olympics introduced an international audience to California design. In San Francisco, Michael Vanderbilt, Michael Cronin, Michael Mabry, and Jennifer Morla explored geometric forms and high-energy color combinations. Their work took postmodern forms and mixed classical typography, flat shapes, illustration, and photography. The result was work that might have been done at the Bauhaus, if the Bauhaus had been somewhere sunny. The 1990s saw the rise of deconstruction and the digital revolution. Lorraine Wild, Jeff Keaty, and Ed Fella all taught at Cal Arts. They worked with ideas of deconstruction and critical theory. Their students entered the marketplace in California and New York. This influenced experimental work throughout the United States in the 1990s. In 1994, our firm, Adams Morioka, was founded, and we looked toward minimalism and modernist concepts. We rejected the complexity of form prevalent at the time, working with simple shapes and objective imagery. The difference from strict modernism being the layering of multiple concepts into one solution. These ideas were introduced at an AIGA conference in New York, and then articles in international magazines, spreading the influence of California design. Design in California matched the growth of the economy. Aerospace, entertainment, culture, and technology industries expanded throughout the late 20th century. Today, the largest percentage of designers in the United States works on the West Coast. It was the values of education, exploration, and freedom that nurtured the industry, creating an international influence. As I was putting this course together, I repeatedly bumped into the issue of time. Each of these individual subjects, from the Bauhaus to postmodernism, could fill an entire 2-hour course. We've covered a vast amount of material here. It's obviously a subject I love, and hopefully the introduction here will lead you to a time period or movement that inspires you. The history of graphic design is complex and multi-layered. I've broken the subjects into individual sections, but in reality, they all overlap in time. Some of the subjects, like the Bauhaus, influenced design for decades. Others occurred simultaneously, like Dada and Stil. Here, we touched on the tip of the iceberg. For every single designer we discussed, there are 10 more just as influential and interesting. But there are threads that become apparent. Graphic design history is the concrete history of our culture. It reflects the attitudes, beliefs, and events of a time and place. The artifacts designers created are the physical manifestations of a time. A poster from the Futurists is about more than energetic lines and colors. It reflects a society grappling with new inventions and ideas. The Whole Earth catalog is more than a cover with a circle and line of type. It reflects a culture moving toward radical new ideas. The best graphic design works at a visceral level, speaking to the viewer emotionally. Graphic design history tells us who we were and not what we thought, but what we felt. Design history also expands our toolkit. You probably don't want to liberally rip off a Japanese poster, but understanding what they made and why they did it gives you, as a designer, more to work with. There are many books on graphic design history, some listed in the exercise files. I urge you to do a deeper dive into an area you find intriguing. Believe me, there are images and ideas that will change the way you work. And remember, it's not about studying hard for a quiz on the Civil War. It's an exploration for inspiration.